Pre-game show here. Pretty good light reading. I have gone through the November 1965 Fantastic Fiction magazine, and I've been reading some of the short stories in here. There's it's called a serialized novel called Axe and Dragon, which I would like to start reading, but I would like to be able to, I'd have the whole thing in hand before I start reading that. Serialized stuff, especially when it involves back issues, is a kind of a dicey thing. But yeah, I read Wild Talents Incorporated by Robert Sheckley, and that is about a guy who runs a specialized sort of unemployment agency for people with special gifts like telekinesis, psychokinesis, and mind reading, second sight, that sort of thing. So it's kind of neat. Like there's one guy who has the ability to identify alloys, just very specific knowledge. He can identify alloys with 40% accuracy, and so he gets him a job at metal plant. There's a name for it, but I'm forgetting what it is. But anyway, refinery, that's it. It's kind of a metal refinery, and he feels really self-conscious about it, even when he's out there with his powers and he's useful on the job. So he quits, and then he finds out that the entire production line, even though he was only 40% accurate, that the fact that they would have to go back and have it reassessed that 60% of the time was still more cost effective than the entire apparatus that they had for verifying purity of metals prior to him. So they wind up building their entire sort of like assembly line around him. Anyway, it's really interesting, and it's one of these like science fiction, it's like thought experiment stories that goes in some neat directions. And the other one is Tooth or Consequences, which is the most blindingly just goofy name, by Robert Bloch. And Robert Bloch is one of these sort of like vintage science fiction writers, very much Rod Serling Twilight Zone era writer, and in fact I'm pretty sure he wrote several of those episodes. And it's a fun vampire story. It's one of these short stories that is very conventional in many of the beats and things that it brings up, but what it does with them is interesting in its own right. And so far as the movies this week go, let's see, there's the Donald Ritchie Film Anthology, which I'm very excited about. Donald Ritchie is the author of the 100 Years of Japanese Cinema book that I'm reading, and these are the 15 to 30 minute surviving segments of a lot of really old films that I'm very excited to take a look at. The Nikatsu Diamond Guys, the sort of like anthology of sampler films of the leading men from the Nikatsu film studio. And Who's Camus Anyway? And I had never heard of this before, and I found it on the shelf at Scarecrow Video, so I thought, you know what, it's a more modern one, so I'll try it out. But yeah, before we hop into the game, this was people seemed to like this last time, so we will do it again. Again, like I've been watching at a pace of about 3 movies a week. A lot of older Japanese cinema from 1930s through typically 1980s is where my sort of like interest sort of stops, but I've watched a few beyond that. And so I've accumulated quite a lot of that, a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings, a lot of screenshots. And so that's going to be kind of a fun thing to integrate into these pregame shows while kind of waiting for people to kind of trickle in. And yeah, so the thing, and I can't guarantee that these are going to be especially insightful or even smart, but they're things that I like, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So there's this one character that it's a recurring character called Tange Sazen, and he is a one-armed, one-eyed samurai who was mutilated in a duel. The sort of implication is he was always done wrong and left for dead, survived his injuries, and then went on, of course, to become even more powerful than ever, as these things go. It's a very superhero sort of start to his tale, and films starring him go all the way back to like the 1930s. And I think maybe kind of the way that you might think about the way these films happen regarding him is, think about like the Spider-Man movies. Where there's I can think of 3 Spider-Man movies on hand that have the origin story four actually, that had the origin story in there, and it's the same story. You know all the beats, you roughly know how it's going to turn out, and you're not super surprised on that front. But it's the way that it's executed that's what's interesting. And I think we've probably all hit our fill on Spider-Man origin story movies, which is why I think they're making few of them. But yeah, this is that. It's that sort of thing. And almost every story involving Tange Sazen involves some sort of object that contains clues to the whereabouts of fabulous treasure. And so that's always the MacGuffin. And so you have the character and the MacGuffin, and the story that's crafted around that varies from film to film, and that's kind of one of the things that we're going to look at here. My favorite Tange Sazen is actually it's called The Million Ryo Pot by Sarao Yamanaka, who made the movie whose stills we looked at last time. But in order to kind of like describe why I like that, we're going to look at some of the other ones by comparison. So this is a classic Tange Sazen look. You got the one eye. This is Tamba Tetsuro, who is very storied, very, very beloved, and very well featured face of Japanese cinema from like the 50s through the 70s. Stars in a lot of samurai jidaigeki movies, and then kind of promotes to a lot of Yakuza movies when those become popular. But here he is. You see, he's got the one eye. He's got a sort of darker undershawl and a white kind of like overcoat, and that's sort of the typical thing, the typical sort of garb for this character. And this one is it's called the one-eyed Evening Iceman Dan. No, if you don't have a good MacGuffin, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Personally, I mean, not your life personally. I can't attest to that, but I'm glad you have a good MacGuffin, and I hope you do. Yes, every text needs a pretext. You're exactly right. But yeah, this one is a little more, I want to say, kind of rote, a little more, I don't want to say by numbers, but it's a very stock adventure story. There is, the way two of these start out is there is a clan called the Yagyu clan, and they have enemies, always fighting. Between clans and factions, but the fighting isn't overt. It's always political. It's always undermining. It's always subterfugal. I don't know. When you watch enough of these things, you really start to see where all of the double dealings and the political double crossings and triple crossings that show up in the Metal Gear games, you see exactly the story heritage that stuff comes from. For all of the Western films that Hideo Kojima traces his like lineage back to, like when you start watching this stuff, you can like see like, oh, that's kind of the tradition. But kind of the political machinations that they put in effect is they were like, you know what, we really want to get rid of the Yagyu clan, so let's nominate them for the honor of repairing this, Big Cheese's shrine. And the cost of repairing the shrine is astronomical and will absolutely ruin the clan. But because it is also an honor to be chosen, they can't refuse it, because then it just insults a bunch of people. So they have like no good way out. And so the only way out is to find this fabulous treasure. And in this one in particular, there's like a sword that's got an inscription on it. And there's a whole search that goes on for it. And he is kind of... he's kind of a Robin Hood character in this one. He's kind of a king of the underclass, a lord of the underclass, and he steps up and inserts himself into the conflict. And also in good Robin Hood, Locksley form. He also comes from nobility and that sort of thing. But it kind of there's build up, event, counter event, turn of fate, counter turn of fate, and it all builds up to this, good Chanbara showdown where it's one man against many, and this is kind of the feel of it, right? This is the scene that's going to show up a lot, but there are the dead around, enemies awaiting, and then there's the foe in front of him, and eventually, but see, it does come back from like fighting many, kind of very Muso kind of fighting to one-on-one. And it ends with his victory. Of course, he comes out on top. So it's a very hero thing. It's like you see the hero that he is. He turns out to be that hero. You come away having seen the movie you thought you were going to see. And then the next one, this kind of shows up a little bit later. This is Nakamura Kanosuke, I think. I know his first name is Konosuke, but I think Nakamura is right surname. Anyway, he is a fantastic actor to the extent that Tamba Tetsuro tends to do the same kind of sort of like anti-hero or understandable villain. Or just mean villain kind of role. This guy is versatile as hell. Just like does so much good stuff. And but this is, you can see the same kind of character type, right? The black undergarment, white overgarment, missing eye. And this one, whereas the other one is very much like this is a Robin Hood character and it's the adventure of a Robin Hood character. This one is actually more of a character focused thing, so it actually goes into kind of his life. So you actually get to see his origin story. Oh yeah, this one also features Tamba as a supporting character, so it's kind of neat that this guy winds up being the lead in one version of this story and then as a supporting character in another, and that's just kind of neat thing that you run into. But yeah, you get to see his backstory, get to see how he becomes, the hero he is, loses his eye. Oh yeah, and the arm that he loses is his sword arm, so when he becomes awesome and superpowered later, it's his weak arm that he becomes powerful with. Yeah, there you go. And Gosha does this really nice thing that he cuts to that to birds flying in the sky under the same background. And yeah, it's lovely. But yeah, and so you have like the Robin Hood thing, the one against many, and this one is much more character focused, so it's just him versus a nemesis, and it's the violence is much more personal and individualized. But this is the thing that keeps showing up, this sort of setup. This isn't the only movie that this shows up in, but it's the same kind of yes, like very much like Ocelot losing his arm to Grey Fox. That motif shows up in, I don't want to say it shows up all the time, but consistently enough that you recognize it as a pattern. Thank you, that's a really good example. But this particular kind of standoff with Sazen on the right and Foe on the left, kind of the white garb and the black garb, that shows up. So here is that from a different angle and in a different setup. But, the violence is much closer, much more personal, less far away, less choreographed, and much more about facial expressions and that sort of thing. So it turns it from like from a story where he is a type to a story where he's a character. And that's a little more interesting. But my favorite one, and I think this goes so far, this really can be abstracted just kind of how like superhero stories are done in general, is this 1935 one where rather than being sort of like a rollicking bandit or somebody with a dark grudge to bear, he's incredibly powerful and he lives in the back of a bar. And a lot of what he does, it's like, you kind of know based on what you know about the character, you know that he is this storied, very powerful swordsman, and so the movie can take that knowledge, no backstory needed. It's like just you assume you know the character's origins, and it uses that to really interesting effect. So like there are certain things where like he's given like this mundane errand which just requires a drop of kindness to respond to. Most people would be like, okay, sure, I'll be a good guy and do that, but he is constantly on the hero's edge of adrenaline. So he's like, would you be so kind to walk Shichibe home later? And he's just like full of piss and vinegar. He's like, hell no, absolutely not. I've got better things to do. I hate your singing and I hate your sake and I'm going to bed. I absolutely refuse to accompany him. Sideswipe. Oh, this is fine. Thank you so much. So it's just like, there's like no explanation given. Absolutely zero. There's just like a very quick ellipsis and it just cuts straight to that. And then there are other things where it's like, he has to go tell a kid that his dad died, and he goes up to him, and instead of like, and he's also full of bluster prior to that. He's like, I got something to tell you, and like he just absolutely cannot tell him, and just like caves into, are you hungry? And even when it finally gets to that sort of Chanbara moment at the end, this shot in this posture. So you have him here in this dojo. And it's the same thing there. It's the same thing there. Exact same shot, exact same setup. And it's always that showdown that sort of shows you what this version of the character is doing and who he is. And yeah, so he's kind of showing up to kind of shake down this dojo. It's a thing that a lot of Ronin do in these movies, where they show up to a dojo, they beat everybody up, and then they demand a ransom because they won. And it's just this really jerk thing to do, and that's what he's doing. But he winds up getting there, and he wins, and he's successful, and he finds out that that guy who's the head of the dojo is his old drinking buddy. And during the fight, the drinking buddy is like, I'm really not as good as you. Please lose to me. I will pay you money. And then they'd haggle during the fight and finally agree to pay to throw the fight. And so you go from like these like really storied, over the top superheroes to just absolutely petty, super small hearted, and it's just ridiculous. And I think that's really good because this kind of connects to Metal Gear. I promise it does connect to Metal Gear, where a lot of Metal Gear's turns depend upon events are not what they seem, and this is more like people are not what they seem. And I think that is a very interesting way of handling a story, and the way this character is handled in different iterations kind of makes me think of the way the different snakes are handled across the different versions. So, but yeah, with that in mind, here we go.